Could Vance Joseph be on his way back to the Denver Broncos with an interview set up as the defensive coordinator and Garett Bolles on the trade block? You get that and much more in today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you're watching on YouTube. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, Sayre expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, I'm in Chicago right now, right? I'm obviously traveling, and it just seems like every day there's some more information that comes out that makes us kind of scratch our head and say, like, is this the path that the Broncos are going? And that involves a potential player on the trade block. It also involves several other things on the coaching realm side of things. But let's dive into this new thing that has come out about Garett Bolles potentially being on the trade block for the Broncos. Want to get your initial thoughts on it, and then we can expound into maybe the why and also maybe some solutions if that is truly the case.
Well, Cody, like you said, we got a lot to discuss on this episode. So everybody who's listening, grab an effing snack and get ready for this because we're about to jump in. The first big news, I guess, of the last couple days is the Garett Bolles rumor, right? Of course, our good friend Mario Vitanzi kind of threw it out there on Twitter a few days back saying, hey, a big name Broncos player could be on the trading block. The team may look to shop him if the price is right this offseason. And then we kind of saw, other outlets talking about it. I know Troy Rank talked about it, and Benjamin Albright at 850 KOA, they talked about it as well. You see people liking tweets, and you see tweets that get posted and then deleted and certain things like that. And it just all comes together to make you wonder what is going on behind the scenes with Garett Bolles. So here's what we know to be factual at this point, Cody. We know that Garett Bolles has a cap hit in 2022 of $17.8 million. He's coming off a major injury. Obviously, the thought coming off an injury might be, would Garett Bolles do what we saw Graham Glasgow do last year when he was coming off a similar injury, right? He had a fractured leg against the Dallas Cowboys. He took a pay cut. He restructured his contract. Will Garett Bolles do the same? And if not, is that the ultimatum to say, well, then we're going to have to trade you? Or even, I know Broncos fans wouldn't like this at all, release you. Would they release Garett Bolles outright if they could say, sign somebody that they felt comfortable with for a 1 or 2 year vacuum? And then would they release him and take those cap savings? There's so many different factors at play here, but typically when a player is on the way to being let go, maybe outright, maybe released, the first sign is, hey, you start shopping them publicly in trade rumors. Obviously, it seems like the Broncos kind of tried to shut those rumors down. But Cody, I don't know where to go with this. I feel like you and I have talked about maybe Garett Bolles being on the outside looking in this offseason. It seems like this gives a little bit of legs to those thoughts.
Yeah, here's my thought process on it as well, regarding Garett. Anytime a team approaches usually a player to say, hey, will you restructure your contract? And anytime that they usually say no, or they are like, nah, I'm not going to do that, they are usually put on the trade block a little bit. And so part of me is wondering, did the Broncos approach Garett Bolles, ask him to restructure? He said, I'm not doing it. And then they're saying, okay, well, if that's not the case, like your cap hit is significant, we need to make some moves to make this team better. We may look at trading you. Obviously, those of you that know, you mentioned Mario. It's not hard to connect the dots that Mario and Garett are very close. Like they hang out all the time. Mario posts pictures all the time of him and Garett. So it's like, I think everyone's like, oh, who's this Mario guy? It's like, if you know Mario, you know that Mario's got a lot of great connections to players. Like he does. He works on them, and he's a healer. He's got the healing hands there. Outside of that, I think you also have to ask yourself this, Sayre. We looked at free agency, right? If anything, the Broncos are going to try to get draft capital if they do trade Garett Bolles. But the thing that stands out to me is that there is nobody in free agency that is going to come in and I think be serviceable at left tackle. Here's where I think you need to re-sign Calvin Anderson to the Broncos because, like I said, I think when he was playing at left tackle this season, I thought he did a really good job. I didn't see really any holes in his game playing on the left side of that offensive line. He has the strength, he's got the athleticism, he's got the good technique, and now you have an offensive line coach that can teach, that can coach, and I'm excited to see maybe how it fits, but there isn't anybody on the free agency market that is appealing enough to say, okay, hey, you're going to be our left tackle. What do we talk about as the biggest issue for Denver going to the offseason? It is the offensive line. And so if you get rid of a guy who's arguably probably your best offensive lineman, what are you going to do? Like, to me, that is the concern. That's the pain point I want to talk about. So for me, I feel like, okay, if you're going to trade Garett Bolles, you need to find a way to keep Calvin Anderson, and he needs to be your left tackle next season.
I agree with that completely. And I think that speaks to kind of what could be the potential plan, right? Is to see maybe if you could do a little more, not necessarily budget friendly because the Broncos need it, but maybe taking some calculated risks with a coaching staff that you believe in or a system that you think is going to be better for these guys, right? Calvin Anderson showed some stuff at left tackle, in my opinion. I think that Broncos fans will mostly all agree. Everybody was kind of up in arms over the fact that he got benched, remember, late in the season by Butch Berry and would have been reinserted into the starting lineup by Ben Steele and obviously interim head coach Jerry Rosburg if he hadn't been on IR. So there's something to that, I think. And with Garett Bolles, for those that are wondering and those that aren't able to look it up right now, the Broncos could save just under $10 million whether they cut or trade him before June 1st. So it doesn't matter. It's not like they save more money by cutting him and they're trying to drum up trade interest because, it's a last ditch effort. They save the same amount of money, whether they cut or trade him, if that ends up happening. To me, Cody, you're exactly right on this. It's like, what are the alternatives? I don't know exactly what those are at this point. I think Orlando Brown Jr. may be the number one free agent left tackle, but behind that, it's kind of a lot of question marks. A lot of guys.
Is he going to leave
right
Kansas City?
Is he even going to leave Kansas City? You could be looking at the pro scouting department. These guys, they all know, okay, who's the likeliest cap casualties this year? So they may be looking ahead to that. Maybe somebody like a Tyron Smith or the Dallas Cowboys. But then you bring in a new potential wave of questions. Is he going to be able to stay healthy? I think all roads lead back to Calvin Anderson ultimately being brought back in some capacity, or maybe there's somebody from the Saints that's kind of been like a similar type of Calvin Anderson type of guy that we don't really know about, somebody that Zach Strief has been coaching the last couple of years or Sean Payton knows well. There might be somebody like that out there, but I think all roads lead back to that. The Broncos have to bring in somebody that can give them comfortability if they do say, hey, we want to trade Garett Bolles. We want to cut Garett Bolles and we want to use that $10 million somewhere else. It gives them the flexibility to do that. If you have a Calvin Anderson and maybe a Cam Fleming on the roster already, then you can go to the NFL draft and say, we like these two guys if need be. And then we have these 2 third-round picks. And maybe we find a starting tackle there. It seems like a very nickel and dime sort of approach, I think, from the outside perspective. But for NFL coaches that know what they're doing and executives that know what they're doing, they're 4 or 5 steps ahead in terms of the cap casualty market of what other teams could be. If the Broncos are thinking about trading Garett Bolles, what are other NFL teams looking to do, right? So we don't necessarily know exactly what the alternatives are, but it does seem like Garett Bolles may have one foot out the door in Denver.
Going to be very interesting to see how things play out. I know for me personally, when you mentioned, the NFL draft starting offensive tackles, 3rd round, I was like, oh gosh, like Russell Wilson, like you have this investment in Russ and you're going to go with, 3rd round offensive tackles as you start. I mean, we've seen crazier things happen, right? And I don't want to pinpoint and kind of say, okay, well, just because this guy was taken around 3 means he's not going to be a good offensive tackle. That changes every year. We see really good players come out and emerge as starters, undrafted guys, 7th round guys, 5th round guys. So it's not always about like where you're taking. I just think it's the widespread perception of that I think has everybody a little bit of up in arms about that as a possibility. But Broncos country, we are always eager for your thoughts on Garett Bolles being on the trade block. What would you like to see happen with Denver if he is traded? Would you like to see Calvin at left tackle? Drop your comments down below in the YouTube comments section. But on today's episode of the show, a former Broncos head coach is now in the mix for the defensive coordinator job. Yes, he might be back. Vance Joseph. What are the prospects of that? We'll dive into that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. The midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, and it's super easy to use. And then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. Don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Could Vance Joseph make his way back to the Denver Broncos in a defensive coordinator capacity? That is an option that is on the table for Sean Payton as he looks to build his staff. Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcasts in audio format or whether you watch on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. Sayre, my friend, on Wednesday night, our good friend Mike Kliss put out the report that former Arizona Cardinals defensive coordinator, former Denver Broncos head coach Vance Joseph is set to interview with the team for their vacant defensive coordinator job. That's not the only defensive coordinator nugget that we got to throw out there. We'll obviously talk about Sexy Rex here in a little bit. But the question is, like, for Broncos country, I've already seen a lot of responses on Twitter. They're like, oh, don't bring Vance back. From an objective standpoint, right, considering how bad it was with him as a head coach and some of the things that went on because he had his hand in the defense too much and it messed with Joe Woods, things that were going on with Joe Woods. My question to you is this something that you would welcome for the Broncos? Would it make sense for Vance Joseph to potentially be the next defensive coordinator for Denver?
I mean, I would welcome it. Honestly, Cody, I think what have we talked about? What's been a theme of what we maybe kind of sense Sean Payton is looking for at that defensive coordinator spot, right? Maybe a head coach of the defense or a former head coach being able to take charge over the defense. Certainly Vance Joseph fits that description. And hey, if he's looking for a job and he may be the best candidate for the job, why would you not interview him, right? Obviously, Jonathan Gannon is going to be taking over the defense in Arizona. He's the new head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. And being that defense is his expertise, it would make sense that Vance Joseph probably going to be looking elsewhere, especially because Vance, he interviewed for that head coaching spot as well. So to me, Cody, I don't hate this move at all. I know that a lot of Broncos fans have a lot of bad taste in their mouth from somebody like Vance Joseph, but look, it's a different role. It's a different era of Broncos football. I mean, I'm not opposed to. I think if you go into something completely opposed, you find it that ends up happening, and you find yourself automatically disappointed because you were opposed to the idea instead of being open-minded to the idea. At least that's how I find myself a lot of times, Cody. If I'm really opposed to something, like I was to Joe Flacco being the quarterback, sometimes you end up being right, but sometimes you end up being wrong as well if you're really opposed to stuff. So I'm not opposed to Vance Joseph. I think he brings an interesting element in terms of the calling the defense. I don't think that's been a problem. Like in Arizona last year, the health of that unit was a major problem. Losing Chandler Jones was a major problem. And obviously their numbers took a hit as a result, but I don't think Vance Joseph is a bad defensive play caller. You look at that 2021 Cardinals defense when everyone was healthy. That was a unit that I think had people talking, maybe Vance could be a head coach again. So him being a defensive coordinator in Denver, certainly not opposed.
Well, and they also dealt with a lot of injuries this past season, specifically in Arizona. You had J.J. Watt, who had some ups and downs. I mean, had a career resurgence in Vance Joseph's defense despite dealing with injuries. And, he obviously retired. Byron Murphy was a guy who's banged up a little bit for them this past season. I think I'm intrigued to see, like, what would Vance Joseph do differently as a coordinator here in Denver versus the time, right? Because I think a lot of people also combine the fact that, okay, he was here under a different regime. This is a new regime entirely. It's George Payton. It's Sean Payton. It's the Walton Penner family ownership group. None of these pieces were in place with the Broncos when Vance Joseph was previously here. Now, I think for Vance, he's always been like respectful of the Broncos, when asked about like what happened. And, he said, it just didn't work out. And so I think that's good. And I think this is a great example why, as a coach, even if you get fired, right, you never want to burn any bridges because it could circle back to you getting an opportunity. And I think Vance Joseph has been very humble about his time in Denver and has ultimately chalked it up to as a learning experience, right? a leader, a man, a guy that players in the locker room are like, yeah, hey, I really respect this guy, but it was almost like the Hackett thing. Like, okay, hey, he's our boss. I respect him, but it's like, I don't know if this is a guy that can motivate me to play football, as a head coach stature in a sense. So we'll see how things play out here. I think the thing you have to look at specifically with a guy like Vance Joseph is how might this impact personnel? I think you'd see the defense stay the same. I think you and I have talked about that. Preserving this defensive scheme, I think, has been very important in terms of our bucket list, checking off a box. Now, we have had some people on YouTube comment. We've had some people on Twitter say like, oh, get rid of the Fangio style of defense. It doesn't work. Half the NFL is using it, right? And I think we're confusing, seeing things happen with other teams. It's called differently by every defensive coordinator that runs the too high shell look, and they do a lot of the Fangio-based concepts that have really excelled in the NFL. It's all dependent upon how you call that defense. That's really what it is. And you can do the same exact thing, right? It's like in life. There's people who do the same exact thing that you do. However, how can you do it better, right? And I think that we saw Ejiro Evero do a really good job with that last season. Obviously, Vic Fangio has done a tremendous job throughout his career coaching doing that. Ed Donatel struggled in Minnesota last year. Not sure if that had to do with personnel or just the fact that he wasn't Vic Fangio. So I don't think the idea of getting rid of the Fangio defense is the answer. I think that the Fangio defense is the counter to today's modern offense of the 3-by-1, the empty, and all these different coverage rules that you have that changes, that helps, gives you as a defensive guy an advantage against some of these offenses that have, they can run pick routes to get you. So for me, how can Vance Joseph preserve that? We know he likes to blitz a lot. We know he's very aggressive with that. They ran a lot of cover zero in his time in Denver, and that led to obviously, Bradley Roby having some rough games against Robbie Anderson and the New York Jets just a couple years ago. I know we remember that one, Sayre, but yes. I'm indifferent to it. I think for me, my stance on the whole entire defensive coordinator search, right, and I think you make a great point. Try not to get too attached to a candidate, but also maybe keep your options open, right? So for like Rex Ryan, people are like, oh, why don't you like Rex Ryan? I'm like, I'll explain that in the segment that's coming up here on the show. It's not that. It's just I'm skeptical, right? I think we have the right to be skeptical on some things, and then we can reserve our judgment to see how things play out. But for me, I'm excited to see what happens. We'll see if Vance Joseph can dethrone Rex Ryan as one of the top candidates for the Broncos defensive coordinator job, which leads to our next point, Broncos country. According to Ian Rappaport, according to Mike Garafolo of the NFL Network, Rex Ryan has emerged as the Broncos' top candidate for the defensive coordinator job. What might that look like for the Broncos since he hasn't really called the defense since 2008? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever wanted to be an NFL general manager, now is your opportunity to do that all from the palm of your hand. You can simulate a situation where you can rename your team to the Denver Broncos, and you can be in control of the team that you root for every single day on Sunday. With the Ultimate Football GM, you're responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right coaches and the coordinators. Yes, you get the power to hire and to fire. You can trade players. You can navigate your franchise through free agency, the draft, and all the ups and downs that a season brings. All of this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free. It's playable offline. You could play on the go as you want, when you want to. And we've created a Locked On League for you to compete against other Locked On fans all over the world. Can you be the ultimate Locked On Football GM? Choose the Locked On League in the app to join. Can you create a football dynasty? Locked On Broncos listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure you check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM, start your dynasty today. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you watch on YouTube. Sayre and I, we appreciate you so much for taking time out of your day to listen and engage with us, talking all things Denver Broncos football. With that said, let's continue on today's episode of the show. Rex Ryan, according to NFL Network insiders Ian Rappaport and Mike Garafolo, two very well-connected sources, by the way, unless they're connected to Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers says nobody knows what I'm doing. So we'll go to that point here. They reported on Wednesday night that Rex Ryan has emerged as the top candidate for the Broncos DC job. Now, keep in mind, yes, he was the head coach for the New York Jets for quite some time. They had some appearances in the AFC Championship game. they had a really good team in New York, even though that they finished second in that division every single year behind it. Guess who? Bill Belichick and Tom Brady. That was a tough dynasty to try to have to overcome there in New England. So they were able to make their hay in that division, in the wild card, even though they didn't win their division. So I think that's something you can absolutely applaud with them. The last time he coached, he was fired by the Buffalo Bills after the 2015 season. So he's been out of the game almost 7-8 years. But he also, and Ian Rappaport pointed this out, he hasn't been a defensive coordinator. He hasn't been an active defensive play caller since 2008. Sayre, the last time that was happening, 2008, Ryan Clady was a rookie for the Broncos at offensive tackle. Mike Shanahan was still the head coach. Jay Cutler was the quarterback, and I was a freshman in high school. That was a long time to not be able to call defense. And a lot of people say, well, he called the defense in New York. No, he wasn't. He had his defensive structure called by Mike Pettin, who was with him in Baltimore when he was the defensive coordinator there. So for me, it's like Rex is getting back in the game. And if he's going to do it with Denver, this is why I'm skeptical, right? And like I said, I'm not going to judge a move until I see the results, but I'm skeptical. And I think a lot of Broncos fans are. And I think that's okay to be skeptical of this being a potential move for the Broncos.
Well, and I think that's kind of where you and I talked about the last time we talked about Rex Ryan, where we talked about maybe having a passing game coordinator come along with him. Like this wouldn't be it's Rex and nobody else type of hire. It would be almost like him plus somebody else, whether that's the Broncos' own Christian Parker, whether it's Sean Desai, whether it's, Chris Richard or whoever it may be. Pairing him up with somebody who understands the modern concepts, who's called plays recently, or who would be able to call. I mean, there's ways to go about it that I think you could make it make sense. What's very interesting to me, Cody, is the fact that Vance Joseph report came out after the reports of Rex Ryan being the top candidate for the Broncos DC job, and also Rex Ryan's colleague at ESPN, Adam Schefter, he hasn't said nothing about the whole situation here. He has been silent when it comes to the Broncos defensive coordinator thing. And we all know, remember when he was on Pat McAfee the day before Sean Payton was hired, he kind of acted like he knew a little something, and turned out he did. So I don't know. I'm just so interested by this whole thing. It goes back to, remember the one thing we talked about a ton during the head coach hiring process? It's like, what is the reporting situation here with this whole thing? Like, even in the article that Mike Kliss dropped about Vance Joseph being requested for an interview, that's the other thing, everybody. Like, when you're listening to this, like, as of the time we're recording this, only an interview has been requested. We don't even know if Vance Joseph will interview for the Broncos job. But in Mike Kliss's article, Cody, he said that the only interview that he and 9 News could definitively confirm, like that somebody had actually interviewed with Sean Payton, he said the only one he could confirm was Sean Desai. So I think that's very fascinating when you think about how everything has unfolded, the rumors that have emerged, Rex Ryan being considered a top candidate, that coming from the NFL Network side, like you said, 2 of their top 3 insiders, Garofalo and Rapsheet, whereas Adam Schefter, who works at the same network as Rex Ryan, has said nothing. And why? Why would, if it was a breaking story about his colleague, you don't think that he would know first? I think all of this is so fascinating. But to your point about Rex Ryan, one thing that I thought of really quickly that I like the thought that he stuck it out in the AFC East, right? During that Patriots dynasty, like he was there with the Jets. He hated the Patriots, that he reveled in beating the Patriots whenever they did. And then he up and turns around and goes and joins the Buffalo Bills right at the end of their just total drudgery. So I think that, man, you got to respect at least that from his vantage point of being like, hey, I'm going to stick it. I want to beat Tom Brady, because what do the Broncos need right now? They need people that hate the Kansas City Chiefs, that want to take down Patrick Mahomes. So at least from a mentality standpoint, I kind of dig that.
No, I'm with you. I like that completely, because far too often the narrative has been, no one wants to go coach in the AFC West against Mahomes, Herbert, Carr. Well, obviously, Carr's now gone officially. That'll be interesting to see how the Raiders offseason plays out. But, as well, like Sean Payton, do you remember seeing the tweet that he put out shortly after he was hired, where it was like hashtag insiders on the outside? Like, nobody, like I'm telling you, like guys like Kliss, who are so well connected, like I said, I have relationships with players and agents, right? I'm not going to be able to break big stories first necessarily until, I have to work my way up the ladder a little bit. But it seems like here in Denver, not even like Albright, like nobody in Denver is getting scoops anymore the way that they used to. It's all coming from the big national outlets. Like it's coming from the Ian Rappaports, the Adam Schefters. They're the one who reported the hire of Sean Payton. So I think it's going back to the old traditional structure, the old school structure of, hey, if we have anything we absolutely need to break, it's going to Rap Sheet, it's going to Schefter. And to me, I think that's it's a little worrisome with the dynamic, especially, for all of us that are there every day covering the team up close and in person. That's a tough dynamic to deal with, And so it's like, how often is everyone going to be breaking a story from Denver? The dynamic is changing under Sean Payton. And as we all know, throughout this whole process, loose lips sink ships. And Denver, the Walton Penner family ownership group, they are not letting anything out of that building. And, I understand it. I respect it. It allows me to be creative as a reporter because now I get to have more conversations, talk to more players, talk to more agents if I'm really, really trying to get something. But on top of that, just react to things as it's happening. I think everybody in this industry is so caught up on, I need to be the first to report this story. I need to be the first. Everybody's going to report the story, right? You're going to get the first reported by, and then you're going to be like, source confirmed. But the reality is, what level of analysis are you going to bring to the table that helps people understand why it happened and maybe making sense of it? That, I think, is the game that we could play here.
I think you're 100% right about that, Cody. And that's a great point that you make, right? It's not necessarily about being first. It's about how you respond to something in the moment. What kind of level-headed analysis can you bring? And I think when it comes to this kind of a news, with us, with Rex Ryan, like a lot of people initially just very excited about the fact that he's a big name. Like he's a celebrity NFL head coach or former NFL head coach at this point. And so like when you see a big name like that, it gets fans excited. It gets people wanting some hard knocks, right? It gets people wanting to see and hear these guys talk all the time because they're such big personalities. But on the other side, like you mentioned, it's not necessarily hating an idea. It's being skeptical of how something can work when he hasn't been a coordinator since, Cody, 2008 is when I started writing about football completely. It's when I changed my major in college to media studies. And so I think like that's how far back we go. So it's fair to be skeptical about, man, I just don't know exactly how this is going to work out. I'm not as excited as maybe I want to be because I don't know how it's going to work out. That's completely fair. But I guess like Gary Kubiak famously says, we're fixing to find out. And I'm excited for for this whole process. The way it's played out gives us plenty to talk about, it keeps us all interested. We're on the edge of our seat. So it's very entertaining from that standpoint. So I can't hate too much on it. Although I do wish, Cody, things were progressing a little bit quicker, but I think in hindsight, we'll look back and we'll remember the fun journey that was. That it has been a crazy already 2023 offseason. Just imagine what lies ahead.
Yeah, we're not even at free agency yet. We're not even at the NFL draft, and it's just going to be wow. Because really, after the NFL draft, Broncos are going to report for OTAs because they have a brand new head coach. Like, they're going to be on the field quicker than most other teams. So, for me, there's a lot of excitement in the air. There's definitely a reason to be skeptical about some things, but you know what? That's just the nature of the business. Be skeptical until you see otherwise. I think it's fair to question things. I think that a lot of people don't get that. I think people are like, oh, you don't like this move. Why? Like, oh, you're a hater. I'm not a hater. I'm skeptical for the reasons I outlined, for the reasons you outlined. And if you're skeptical, you have every reason to be skeptical as well. Let's see how everything plays out. And then we'll obviously analyze it every step of the way here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But with that said, that will wrap up today's episode of the show, Broncos Country. Thank you so much for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. As we get a little bit closer to March, we're going to start doing some free agency previews and maybe how things change based on Sean Payton's staff that he is building here in Denver. You'll get that on the coming episodes here, Locked On Broncos.